you see. So now go back again to Romans chapter 4. Let's just look at this one more time. Let me read this whole passage one more time that we read. Romans 4, verse 13. For the promise that he, Abraham, should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Point being, the law wasn't around. God just came to Abraham, and Abraham believed it. God gave him a promise, and Abraham believed the promise. He uses this as an example because as Christians, that's our relationship with God. He gives us promise, and we are supposed to believe it. Now, Paul here is warning, and he's sort of saying that the Jews in his day especially, who didn't like the gospel and didn't like what he was preaching, were saying, well, we're keeping the law, therefore we are heirs of what God has for us. But Paul says in verse 14, if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void. In other words, it's not both ways. It's not you earning it and you believe God. It's you believe God, and then therefore it's not about you being good enough. The faith is made void and the promise made of none effect. The point is, Paul says, here's what you need to know about the law. The law produces punishment. The law fixes punishment. And if a person is going to relate to God on their own performance, they're going to be, every time they fail, expecting that punishment. Now, what needs to be factored in is, see, here's what some people will say, and they have said this to me. Well, God's the same God today as he was then. Yes, true, I agree with that. But something has changed. See, if that's all we say, we're leaving Jesus out of the picture. Now here I'd like to illustrate that point to you in a simple little way. Go back to 2 Kings, back to the Old Testament just for a moment. 2 Kings, this is an interesting, nice little story. And I want you to see God's wrath in action. This just punishment for wrongdoing. 2 Kings chapter 1. These are the kings of Israel after David, after Solomon and his children, then the line of kings. And at this time, the nation of Israel had split in two, and there had been a division. 10 tribes in the north formed a nation of their own called Israel. 2 tribes in the south called themselves Judah, based on the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, I believe. And this northern tribe is what we're reading about now, the northern 10 tribes in the northern kingdom. Verse 1, 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. Then Moab rebelled against Israel. This is the northern 10 tribes, after the death of Ahab. And Ahaziah, he's now the king, fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was at Samaria. Samaria is now the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. In the south, they have Jerusalem, and they have the temple. So in the north, they formed their own capital city in Samaria. So here's the king of Israel in Samaria. He fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber and was sick, and he sent messengers. Now listen to what he does. Listen to this now. And said to them, go inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease. Now right away, if you don't know what Ekron is, don't know what Beelzebub is, right away you know he's doing something wrong, because he's going. He doesn't say go inquire of God. He says go to Ekron. In my Bible, there's a little number by Beelzebub, and it says Lord of the Flies. Now you know that doesn't sound very good. This, I guess we would say devil god, this Lord of the Flies. I mean, how, I wouldn't want to inquire of the Lord of the Flies about anything. That sounds terrible, but this is what he's saying. This king of Israel, I'm pointing out that he's doing something very, very bad here. See? Okay. Send to Beelzebub and ask whether I'll recover of this disease. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah, this is God's prophet, the Tishbite, arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say unto them, is it not because there's not a God in Israel that you go to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? A little bit of pointed sarcasm to him. In other words, is it because there isn't a God, you don't know God anymore? That's why you're going to Beelzebub? Verse 4. Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but thou shalt surely die. In other words, he's going to save him a trip. You don't have to go all the way to Beelzebub. I'll tell you ahead of time. Probably not, the kind of news he wanted to get as well. And when the messengers turned, listen, they didn't get to Beelzebub and Ekron. They met Elijah in the way. God sent him, and they ran into Elijah, and he says, listen, go back and tell him, forget it, pal. That's my paraphrase. You're going to die. And verse 5, the messengers turned back to him, and he said to them, why are you now turned back? In other words, what are you doing back here? I thought I sent you off to go inquire of Beelzebub. Verse 6, and they said unto him, Well, there came a man to meet us and said to us, Go, turn again unto the king that sent you, and say to him, Thus saith the Lord, Is it not because there is not a God in Israel, that thou sendest to inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore thou shalt not come down from the bed on which thou art gone up, but thou shalt surely die. Well, they gave him a good report. That's exactly word for word what he said, isn't it? Verse 7. By the way, before we read, how do you think this king's going to feel about this? Probably not going to be very happy. And he said to them, What manner of man was he that came to meet you and told you these words? In other words, what kind of person was this? They answered him, Well, he was a hairy man, and girt with a girdle of leather about his loins. The king said, It's Elijah. I guess he'd seen him before. That's what I thought. I guess he had a little inkling. It is Elijah the Tishbite. So now, stop for a moment. Just put yourself in the position of, let's just think this through. Think the king's very happy with Elijah? No. Is the king on righteous grounds? No, he's completely wrong. Everything he's doing is wrong. And Elijah is speaking for God and giving him the word of the Lord because of this wrong deed the king of Israel is doing. Now, the king thinks, oh, well, it's just one guy. I'll show him. Verse 9. The king said unto him, he sent unto him a captain of 50 with his 50. And he went up to him, and behold, he sat, that's Elijah, sat on top of a hill. And he, that's the soldier, the captain of the 50, spoke to him and said, Thou man of God, the king hath said, Come down. And Elijah answered and said to the captain of the 50, If I be a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven, and consume thee and thy 50. And there came down fire from heaven, and consumed him and his 50. Now, I don't want to stand here and tell you that the devil did this. The devil didn't do this. Came down from heaven. The devil's not in heaven. The devil didn't do this. It was not even natural forces. It was God that did it. And it came down from heaven. And why did God do it? Well, to just put it in common vernacular, they had it coming. That's why. It was God's righteous judgment against this unrighteous king. And I'll admit, it creates a little bit of a moral dilemma, for me to read this, because I think, well, this man's just doing his job. But nevertheless, this is God's, we might say, his wrath, his righteous judgment against sin on many different levels. And the fire came down from God, and it came down from heaven. But I'd like to point out to you, and I'd like to suggest to you, that as we look around today, God's not doing that anymore. God is not doing that anymore. I don't see God sending fire down from heaven. Now, some people will say, oh, well, when there was that tsunami, over there in Ceylon or something, or in India, or Sri Lanka, or wherever. Do you remember that big tsunami that killed a lot of people? I heard, listen, with my own ears, with these here, I'm not just making this, I heard people say that was God's judgment against them. See, it's basically saying the same thing. When the 9/11 happened, when those planes hit, now I heard with my own ears, I heard Christian people saying that was God's judgment against America, as though God would, it almost presents God as, what they're doing, give them the benefit of the doubt. What's being presented is God in this role, in God in the Old Testament. Now, a person might logically say, well, read this story and that's God sent down the fire from heaven against their sin, and it was their judgment on sin. Well, then I'm just going to apply it to now and say it's the same God. He's the same God today. But that leaves something very important out of the equation. We've got to factor Jesus in. Does Jesus make any difference?
Yes.
He does make a difference. And interestingly enough, this very story comes back again in Luke's Gospel in chapter 9. If you turn there with me. I just want to show you this because it's such a beautiful little commentary on what we just read. Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, just to make the point crystal clear that there is a definite difference. Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, beginning with verse 51. Jesus is traveling along and he's headed for Jerusalem. And he knows it's time for him to go to the cross and do his redemptive work and go back to the Father. And he's on the way to Jerusalem to do that. Verse 51 says, It came to pass, when the time was come that he, Jesus, should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans. Now, do you remember that story we just read? That was in Samaria. Remember that? The king of Samaria in Israel. So now they're entering into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for Jesus. Verse 53. They did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. In other words, they knew he was on his way to Jerusalem, so they said, well, we're not going to receive you. And the reason is this long-standing feud between the northern kingdom of Israel with their capital in Samaria, who had a rival temple and a rival religious order, we might even say. And in Jerusalem, there was this hostility. And because they knew he was going to Jerusalem, so, well, if you're going to Jerusalem, that's it. We won't have anything to do with you. Well, that was kind of a bad thing for them to do. It kind of made the disciples a little bit unhappy. Verse 54, listen to what his disciples, James and John. By the way, Jesus called them the sons of thunder. Maybe this is why. When his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, they left out here in parentheses, they were really mad. And I think they were really mad about this. That really made them angry that the Samaritans treated them in such a bad way. James and John saw this. They said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias or Elijah did? Now we know where they got this idea, don't we?